Now here we have Stanley Avenue, which is just off the Yarmouth Road in Thorpe. And my mother used to love this time when the cherry trees were blossoming because she loved the spring. It meant that the season was just starting. We always had dogs on the island because my father was a tremendous wildfowler and pheasant shooter, and so he always had good gun dogs. And the poodle, which was called Sweet Pea, actually grew up to be trained to a gun and was a very good retriever because poodles are actually hunting dogs. And this is the launching of the Princess of Hearts, which was a radical design in those days. It was 1957. And the design of this boat has gone into Broad's cruisers that you see today, the centre cockpit, sliding canopy. A bit high in the water at the moment because they haven't put the engine in yet. And the boats were built, we built one a year, and so they would start building in about July of one year, and then building would stop for the winter when the boats were done up, and then the boat would be finished after Easter and would go out on hire at around June every year. I hope you can see from this that Broad's boatyards in those days had tremendous pride. We didn't have all that many boats, but every year when a new one was built, it was absolutely immaculate. And my parents would take a holiday on the boat for perhaps 2 or 3 days down the river, and then it would come back into the yard with a list of all sorts of things which father had found wrong. They were then put right, and then he would phone Blake's and say, right, you can have the boat. And we had a regular customer, Mr. Green, who always had Hearts Cruises' new boat for 2 weeks and insisted on being the first customer. And he would then come back after his holiday with another list of things that he'd found wrong. And so by that time, you really couldn't find anything wrong with a Hearts Cruises hire boat. Here's my father being rowed across the river in a pram dinghy. I had to have uniform as well, of course. And here were the cleaners on a normal day when they had their overalls on and weren't all done up for the film. We were starting to use all sorts of new materials for seats, and Formica was just coming in. These were days when boat building was changing a lot. This is one of the occasions when we were having a holiday on the newly built boat before she went out on hire. And on this occasion, it's Coldham Hall Regatta. And here you can see the cruiser Mady in the background in the days when she was owned by Jeff Priest and was in her original Bermuda rig before being completely rebuilt by Mike Barnes. Coldham Hall was the first main regatta of the year. It was the end of the Frostbite Sailing Club season, and then everybody went up north and went to Wroxham Broad. Here is father and son in the boatyard launch. All the boatyards had to have a launch because sometimes it was the only way to get to a boat down the river. Here you see Miles Simpson, who is Pat Simpson's father. You can also see Jeff Pleasance, who had the Ranworth Malsters, and the young boy is Jeff Pleasant's son. This was Wroxham Broad, where if the weather was too strong, you had to row the topsail ashore before you went out in the race. There you have Gilbert Wright on the back of the boat, and the boat is being driven by Paul Wright, who is the founder of the Buckenham Sailing Club. The ropes, of course, were all natural fibre. They were sisal and not very many fenders because the hirers were supposed to bring the fenders in when they were underway. That's my Uncle Vernie, who actually was captain of a minesweeper during the war. And this was when the Four of Hearts got sunk by a coaster at Buckenham Ferry. And my parents were on the boat at the time, well, they were in the bar. And father looked out of the window and said, that coaster is not going to get around that bend. And he got out quickly enough to get the dogs off the boat, and it was squashed flat by the coaster. And Gilbert Wright managed to pull it round into the ferry cut before it sank. And this film is the next day when they'd asked the Loddon Fire Brigade to come out and try and pump the boat out. And they all came out as an exercise and all had some fun. And they managed to get enough water out of the boat to float her around into Gilbert Wright's slipway. And then you'll see the boat being hauled out. It was a complete write-off, but the firemen had a lot of fun. They had the thing called the light portable pump, which actually took about 5 men to carry it. And they had 2 on the front of the boat and another 3 on the quay. But Father told me afterwards the boat was squashed completely flat, but somehow sprang out again, and you can see that she's still got the same shape. But inside, all the framework and the main frames and everything are completely ruined. Coasters were a big problem on the Yare, of course, because they sometimes didn't take a pilot. They were supposed to do, but they would sometimes come up the river on the rising tide, but would not realise how sharp some of the bends were. And there was a rule in those days that you never moored on a bend on the River Yare because of this risk of being squashed by a coaster. And the Four of Hearts on this occasion was squashed flat and actually moored on a pub mooring. It wasn't as though she was moored anywhere dangerous. And here we have just views of Hearts in the winter. We don't seem to get winters like this anymore that linger for so long and the river all frozen over. The gunboat originally used to be moored on Thorpe Gardens Quay for the winter because there was no electricity on the island in those days. And it was only later that they got a permanent mooring and she was there for the whole time. But it was a wonderful place to live. It was very much like a house. You had a coal fire and a brick fireplace, a Rayburn stove in the galley up in the bows. So for me, I didn't really know the difference. And the way the tide used to come up as well, that was a spring tide, and the whole quay would flood and the boat sheds would flood as well. And so the boats had to have a patch in the bottom that you could take out so that when the tide came up into the boat shed, the boats wouldn't float off the chocks. That is actually Cyril Fisk on the ferry boat, who used to be the owner of the Friend of All Nations, the ex-Galston lifeboat. But everything had to come across the river in that ferry boat. All the diesel, the coal supplies. In fact, they're breaking the ice up there to bring the coal up into the shed for the heating on the gunboat. And here the river being frozen was after they closed the power station in Norwich, which being coal-fired, it used to put so much hot water into the river that it didn't freeze. And moored on the quay there, you can see the Galston lifeboat Friend of All Nations and the Pleasure Wherry Dragon. And here this is a bit of a put-up job because this was just shots of Father pretending to be shooting. In fact, Sid the gardener was throwing pheasants up in the air and they were filmed falling down again. And you wouldn't go duck shooting on a frozen duck pond, of course. But Father had a pond on the island and this was his wonderful hobby in the winter. We used to virtually live off the garden in the island. Everything was grown there. Father used to shoot all the duck and the pheasants, and there was very little that we had to actually go and buy. My mother had 200 chickens on the island, which she had a licence for in those days, in the days of rationing. And there he is with his limp. He had half his knee blown out during the war, but still carried on all the same. And here's me in my shorts on my way to Langley Junior. Even in the snow we wore shorts. Somewhere in among those schoolboys you will find Peter Jekylls, David Moore, Michael Mack, Jimmy Key and several others who all became well known on the Broads later on. And I like all the old vehicles on the Yarmouth Road there, the old mail van and the British Railways mechanical horse that used to come and deliver parcels. And life for us on the island, of course, every time you walk out of your front door, we had to get into a boat and cross the river. And we all had our own boats, so that hopefully, whichever side of the river you were on, you would have a dinghy or a launch to come back with. If not, you had to swim, which I sometimes did. That was actually one of the first electric boats that they had on the Broads. This was a new idea in those days. and he'd actually had the starter motor off a Morris Navigator and a couple of batteries. And that was sufficient to go backwards and forwards across the river for about 3 weeks before the battery went flat. The island for me was a wonderful childhood because it was so unlike everything else.